So welcome again to session number 6, in fact, the last session of the IPPC before the closing remarks from Martin van Balen. This session is dedicated to really conclude on one of the most important topics, i.e. the growing medical need and growing unmet medical need for PDMPs, for plasma-derived medicinal products. Before I introduce our eminent panel, I would like to make a very short introduction to the topic. This topic really follows on the heels, very closely on the heels of a recent green paper. So those of you who may have read it, this will be a little bit of a reminder. Those of you who haven't yet, I urge you very strongly. The green paper talks about the IgGs, immunoglobulins, the medical need thereof, and also the unmet medical need that we are seeing across many indications. It has many surprising conclusions, and we'll get to that during the panel. So starting on my far right, of course on the far left for you, and I don't mean politically, we have Klaus Kruttwig, who is a specialist in medicines and medical devices, as he always underlines, the medical devices specialist from European Medicines Agency, from EMA. Welcome, Klaus. We are really looking forward to your insights. Then I have referenced the green paper. So we have two clinical experts, giants, so to speak, who have contributed greatly to the green paper creation and will be able to talk to you about some of its aspects. So we have Martin van Hagen from an immunologist or head of the Department of Immunology at the Erasmus Rotterdam Center. We have Jacob van Laar, or rather Jaap van Laar, I believe that's not just for friends, right, Jaap? We are allowed to call you Jaap.
Whatever.
Jaap van Laar, who is a rheumatologist and will speak a lot today about aspects of secondary immune deficiencies, inflammation, and modern treatments that we are seeing outside of PDMPs and how they influence PDMP landscape. And we have Nancy Di Salvo. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you.
As we have said earlier, and I've been overhearing a lot of conversations, that this session, IPPC, always is unique in the way we have this really multi-stakeholder approach. So Nancy represents both a patient advocacy group for CIDP and GBS, but also is a patient herself. So Nancy will be sharing with us in-depth experiences as a patient over the many, many years.
Yes.
And then last but not the least, definitely, Professor Richard Knight, neurologist and professor of clinical neurology, I should say, and importantly, also a person who has been involved on the supply side in the UK, managing Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and really the recent resurgence of plasma collection in the UK. We're not going to be talking about it, but I think it's important if you want to talk about what's happening in the UK. I know that Richard will have some insight on that. So maybe after that session in the networking. So without further ado, I would like to maybe start this discussion with what also the green paper starts with, the clinical landscape. So I'll pose the question, if I may, to all three of you, starting maybe with the more obvious area of immunoglobulins, the immunologist, Martin van Hagen, followed by Richard, and then followed by Jaap. If you can maybe explain the breadth and the spectrum of applications of immunoglobulins in rare diseases, in diseases and indications in general.
Okay, thank you,
Martin.
Thomas. Thank you. Actually, we are talking about immune dysregulation. Immune dysregulation. And in rare diseases, because immunoglobulins are predominantly used most times in very rare diseases. So what is a dysregulation of your immune system? In the past, we talked about immune deficiency, so an impaired immune defense resulting in recurrent infections with morbidities, comorbidities, etc. And we still are using that to explain to our patients. So there's a lack of defense by T cells, immunoglobulins. And in these patients with low amounts of immunoglobulins or an impaired vaccination response, we treat them with immunoglobulins that are extracted from plasma. On the other hand, an immune dysregulation is autoimmunity. And autoimmunity, then you make antibodies against yourself, and your cells are also directed to yourself. And when it's making damage, we call it an autoimmune disease, because most of us have autoantibodies hanging around in your blood. Then there's another kind of inflammation, that's inflammation, a kind of self-explosion, and the immune cells and antibodies are not involved in that. And the last, you can add more, are allergies. And allergies is also a kind of immune dysregulation. So these 4 topics can be seen sometimes, but rare, in one patient. But we see very regularly patients with an antibody deficiency and also autoimmunity, which is actually strange. So we give immunoglobulin therapy in an immune deficiency when there is a lack of enough antibodies. On the other hand, we give sometimes, in rare immune diseases, high-dose immunoglobulins, IgG, to temper the immune system in refractory or severe autoimmune disease. So in immune deficiencies, a low dose, 0.4 gram per kilogram body weight. But in severe immune diseases, autoimmune diseases, we give high dose, 1 to 2 grams per kilogram body weight. So then I stop.
Of course, we'll dig much deeper into this. But no, this is a great sort of tour de force, showing really the extremely broad spectrum. And we will talk about, and I know Professor Knight is going to talk about growing medical need. But what you have portrayed, maybe without explicitly stating so, is that there is a growing either diagnosis or demography that really indicates that IgGs have a vast number of applications and therefore vast growth in need for those treatments.
And then maybe one sentence, because you're telling this, I talked about primary immune deficiencies. So we call them also now, sometimes we know the gene or the phenotype, inborn error of immunity. Nowadays, we have more and more secondary immune deficiencies causing a lack of IgG in blood. So that's an increasing, there's an increasing number of patients with this comorbidity. But I think we talk about it later.
Thank you so much, Martin. So maybe that naturally looping to the growing medical need for IgGs, but also neurology in general, if you can maybe mirror a little bit what Martin has been saying, Richard, in terms of what does that mean for neurology. And I think, during our debates over the past year for the Green Paper, we've all noticed that neurology has been put at a quite level of visibility because it is an area that does use not an increasing number of immunoglobulins, but actually probably proportionally the highest amount of immunoglobulins. So I'll let you explain the neurology landscape and why is there such a high growing medical need beyond immune deficiencies?
Well, it's certainly the case that neurology is responsible for a large consumption of these products and increasingly so, as you can see by various graphs showing this. And I think that I would put it probably in 3 ways. The first is that there's a range of conditions in which there appears to be an immune process attacking the nervous system, and these are well-established things. Inflammatory neuropathies, like chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy, Guillain-Barré syndrome, which you probably heard of, and other conditions like multifocal motor neuronopathy. And these have been known for some time now to have an immune basis and therefore to be responsive to immune modulatory treatments, including intravenous immunoglobulin. And these conditions are chronic. And if you start to run a CIDP clinic, your patients just accumulate. They come back, and you get more and more of them. So the demand increases from that respect. I think in addition, our recognition of these disorders and our ability to diagnose them and our awareness of them has increased so that they do appear certainly to be more common in clinical practice than they were when I first started out. I think the second thing is that on top of that, there has been an increasing recognition that immune processes play a part in neurological disease in ways that we previously did not expect. When I started out as a neurologist, I could get away with knowing nothing about immunology, and now, sadly, that's not the case. Certainly, for example, if we take one specific thing, is the whole business of autoimmune encephalitis, where various antibodies have been discovered to be associated with inflammation in the brain. And this is a very big developing area because these patients present with movement disorders, epilepsy, cognitive dysfunction, but also frank psychiatric syndromes. And there's now a very big interest in the borderland between neurology and psychiatry, and this is a big possibility for further treatments of this sort. And these conditions are increasingly recognized. And I think finally, neurologists have been very reluctant in the past to use immunomodulatory treatments, and they've looked at their rheumatological colleagues and so on with a bit of horror at the sort of treatments that have been used. But I think we've got over that, and as a result, we're now starting to grasp things like multiple sclerosis and other conditions. And as a result of those treatments, it's very likely that neurology is going to generate secondary immune deficiencies which may require treatment.
Thank you so much, Richard. That's a natural loop towards Jaap on being a rheumatologist, being accused of a horror and shock. Before we move you to you, Jaap, I think it is incredibly important what you said. There were two elements you said, that there are more and more specialists who must study immunology, because immunology becomes really permeating lots of disciplines in medicine. And another thing, the burden of disease where we are using immunoglobulins is much higher than just the disease itself. You've mentioned consequences which are psychosocial, which we tend to ignore, but the impact on the patient and impact on the society is enormous. But I'll shut up here and I'll let Jaap respond to being the shock horror as a rheumatologist. If you can maybe comment a little bit, Jaap, on not only the rheumatology and inflammation spectrum, but maybe slightly more on the mode of action of immunoglobulins as well, because one is replacement, the other one is immunomodulation. I know it's a tough topic, but it would be wonderful to hear a little bit more of an explanation, clarification on what that is.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. Well, first of all, I take Richard's comment as a compliment. I think that rheumatologists indeed were at the forefront of introducing new immunosuppressive medication. Our patients have benefited enormously from the development of biological immunosuppressants. And recently also from the so-called targeted synthetic DMARDs. So they've changed the lives both of our patients and doctors. So being a rheumatologist is fun these days because you can really make a difference. In that respect, the use of immunoglobulins is a different beast because the mode of action is still relatively poorly understood. I was thinking how to explain this to you now, and I was looking at these patterns on the ceiling, right? And it's almost like, well, what does it remind you? Spaghetti or some other nice food? But it's a cocktail of different components. And the same is true, of course, for IVIG. IVIG is not, in contrast to engineered biologicals or synthetic drugs. IVIG are just a cocktail of immunoglobulins and usually also a small fraction of cytokines and other soluble mediators. So it's almost impossible for scientists to determine how the IVIG that's administered to patients work exactly. But we know from animal studies that the way IVIG works in vivo in an animal is quite interesting and probably the same in humans. So cells of the immune system, cells of blood vessels, they have so-called receptors which can bind these immunoglobulins. But there are different types of receptors. There are receptors that will stimulate the immune system, and there are receptors that will suppress the immune system. And this balance in suppression and activation is key to the expression of an autoimmune disease. So if you add high dose of IVIG, as alluded to by Martin, you can selectively stimulate the suppressive receptors on these immune cells. So by overloading the blood of patients with these high concentrations of IVIG, you stimulate the suppressive receptor on the immune cells, which thereby leads to attenuation of inflammation. And that's probably a very essential component in the mechanism of action of IVIG. Now, in terms of disease indications in rheumatology, where IVIG is being used, that's still limited, I would say. I think the most classic indication, of course, is dermatomyositis, and randomized clinical trials have demonstrated significant benefit compared to placebo, so there's no doubt about the efficacy in this indication. And then, of course, there are secondary immune deficiencies, which are caused by doctors prescribing very intensive immunosuppressive medication. And we'll come to that later in the discussion, but that's a slowly trickle of patients that are coming through in our clinic. And I would say that the third category of patients, and that too is a new category, is a group of patients that are treated by oncologists, so cancer specialists, with very sophisticated suppressive drugs. And what we have learned is you cannot just treat the patient with these drugs without also having a risk of a side effect. And one of the known side effects now is autoimmune disease. So we are, as doctors, we are confronted with new autoimmune diseases, which are slightly different from the classical ones that we have seen in our clinics, but that also may require treatment with IVIG. So I would say that rheumatologists cannot be blamed for the shortage of IVIG, because we prescribe it judiciously, and the number of indications is limited, but there's definitely still a need for IVIG treatment.
Well, that's probably the clearest explanation of the IVIG mode of action I've ever heard, especially with the noodles or the cocktail you've referred to. So thank you so much, Jaap, for this extremely clear delivery and explanation. I think now that we have had this overview and extreme complexity of the clinical landscape, I think it's good time to ask Nancy about the more streamlined, the real life experience of a patient with IVIG. What does it mean? What real life impact the treatment has? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your story and how that panned out.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me and for having me here. Well, first I want to start with this image here. You saw spaghetti, I saw snakes. So that kind of starts out my story, because I was diagnosed with GBS, with Guillain-Barré syndrome, when I was 20 years old. And it had a very strong impact in my life, of course, at age 20 being paralyzed. And at that point, my treatment was not actually immunoglobulins, but they treated me with corticosteroids, which immediately gave me that boost. And of course, I recovered within a couple of months, but I had a relapse after 14 months. That was the moment in which they did treat me with immunoglobulins, and I became very aware of the difference of the treatment, because I started to recover, and I very well led a normal life for about 14 years. Because after a couple of difficulties that I encountered during my adulthood, I realized that something was not going very well. So I underwent new clinical tests, and I was diagnosed with CIDP, the chronic polyneuropathy that is demyelinating that Professor Knight was talking about. And that was something that really impacted me. And that's when I started to see the snakes, because the chronic version wasn't very delightful. But on the other hand, I was treated immediately with IVIG, high dosages. And I must say that I felt like I was going under recharge, like when your cell phone has no energy and all of a sudden you just put it into the outlet, and I would feel the boost of energy. And from the wheelchair, I started to walk again, and I led a normal life, and the quality of my life has been maintained till this day, in which I am treated with sub-Q immunoglobulins, and I am very grateful for that treatment.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nancy. I think you've alluded to something that I think we're all aware of, but sometimes we don't say explicitly.
Yes.
That the alternative treatments are very often less efficacious, but also have much worse side effect profile and cause relapse. So I think this is an important comment, that IVIGs have an extremely good safety profile and very low impact on side effects, right?
Exactly, it's so true. Well, IVIG maybe gave me some side effects that I dealt with. And on the other hand, sub-Q has very little side effects, and also is easy to administer, and it gives me the possibility to live a normal life and just on the side go to my treatment in my own private moment.
Wonderful. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nancy. That really puts things in perspective, right? Hearing the real story and the real impact. Before we move to Klaus Kruttwig, I know, who will really talk to us about not only the EMA mandate, but also what can be done, I think we should also talk a little bit about the two concepts that have become very important in the Green Paper. The distinction between the growing medical need, the word need, and the growing medical demand. I think there's also often a lot of confusion between the two, and we have heard just before COVID, during COVID, when we have really experienced very limited supply of IVIGs for obvious reasons. There was limited plasma collection, etc., and the supply chains have been broken up. But when we were experiencing that, there have been detractors saying, well, there is no growing medical need. There's merely a growing medical demand that is medically unjustified somehow. We have heard those statements. So I think we should probably go a long way to explain that. And with that very long introduction, Professor Knight, maybe you can illuminate a little bit the issue of medical need versus medical demand and what can we do about it?
I will try. Maybe this is a Rossark ink blot test for us all, because I saw a pit of parasitic worms. Anyway, well, I mean, at a very simplistic level, it's very straightforward, isn't it? I mean, need means that there are conditions which require this treatment, and that's the end of it. And demand is simply how many people order this treatment, but it's much more complicated than that. And I think the first trouble with need is that you have to define, first of all, what is appropriate treatment, and you then enter lots of problems, especially with rare, poorly studied diseases, as to what is the basis for efficacy. And also, you've got to look at the burden of the disease. So obviously, CIDP can be very disabling, but there are certain neurological conditions which are perhaps not quite so disabling, which therefore perhaps have a lesser relative need. And then there's the issue of whether there are other alternative treatments available. So it may be that there is a different way of treating a neurological disease. So the need, again, is a relative need. And you've got to take into account then the practicalities of it all, because there may be another treatment, and therefore the need for immunoglobulin is less, but the practicalities of giving the other treatment may be just insurmountable in some situations. And then on the demand side, there's clearly, again, relative demand, because people may demand treatments for which there's no good evidence, or they may increase their demand by failing to use treatments efficiently. And certainly in my experience for CIDP treatments, at times there has been inefficient use of immunoglobulins, which in recent years has been much tidied up and so on. And then, of course, there's the demand for treating conditions which are really probably shouldn't be treated at all with immunoglobulin. I mean, from my mind, one of the most interesting things is people suggesting treating reflex sympathetic dystrophy, a functional disorder with immunoglobulins. So it's a very complex thing, and it's not surprising that these two things interact and don't match each other. And then there's the whole problem of supply. And of course, there may be need, and it's unmet, so that there may be conditions which are certainly very appropriately treated and with immunoglobulin, and for which there is no really good practical alternative, but for one reason or another, these conditions are not actually recognized, or within a certain specific health system, the treatment is not readily available for all sorts of reasons. So it's a very complex area, and I think what we have to do is try to define as carefully as possible what is need, what is appropriate treatment, bearing in mind that the evidence base may be quite difficult, especially for rare diseases, but taking into account practicability, alternative treatments, as two issues in their own right as well. I think that, well, that's probably all I have to say about it.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much, Richard. This has been extremely helpful. And I think that's already alludes to the framework that we have come up with in the green paper that really takes the unmet medical need, the therapeutic impact, and the quality of evidence. We will talk about this a little bit later. But clearly, as you say, in order to define the need, which then corresponds to the appropriate use, we need a standard framework. And I think that's what the green paper was designed to do, and that's why I urged you, those of you who haven't read it yet, to really dig deep, because I think this is really where we ought to go. But based on that need-demand issue, we obviously have limited supply, or rather limitations. You know, plasma is finite; it's a human resource. With the growing medical need, we clearly have the gap between the supply and the demand. We shouldn't be using those words. They're very unmedical. They seem very commercial, but of course there is that gap. And Klaus, you are a specialist in medicines and medical devices shortages, and EMA has that new mandate. And I would love you to maybe explain to us not only, you know, what must be done from your perspective amongst all of us, all the stakeholders, in order to bridge that gap, but also what is this EMA mandate? What EMA can do, what EMA is doing to address those issues? I know you have a presentation, so this is slightly unusual in this panel. We are not starting with presentations. We're going to intersperse the discussion with presentations. So if we can have that presentation displayed. I think you have a clicker on the stand, Klaus, so if you can use it, that would be great. So over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So two things I want to highlight actually in the beginning. So I saw also worms. So I'm a biologist by training actually. So I saw Caenorhabditis elegans, which is actually a model worm in biology. And also kind of, I learn also every day a lot in the topic of immunology. So that's something I really have to, we really kind of do on a daily basis. So, and I read the green paper, so thank you so much already for the explanation about supply, clinical need, and actually the demand. So today, actually, I would like to give you an overview about actually the new EMA mandate, so that's the regulation 2022-123. And also kind of, I would like to give you an overview about a recent EMA, HMA, EMA, so Heads of Medicine's EMA workshop, actually, it was held beginning of March, that addresses really kind of shortages. And here I would like to give you some feedback and also some recommendations actually, or some actions that have been identified, specifically in a breakout session focusing on immunoglobulins. So in the next slide, actually, I think it's just, oh, I have a clicker. So it does. So that's the disclaimer. So the PowerPoint slides are copyright of the EMA, so reproduction is permitted, provided the source is acknowledged, and I do not have any conflicts of interest. So just a kind of a busy slide now here, and the slide kind of gives an overview about EMA's new mandate. So we do have actually a new regulation, as I mentioned. It's the regulation 2022-123, which became applicable actually in March 2022. And there is, as Thomas already said, actually, there is actually another part of the regulation, and that's kind of a chapter on medical devices. This became applicable actually on critical medical devices during public health emergency. This became applicable actually on the 2nd of February in 2023. So here actually the focus is really on monitoring and mitigating shortages of medicines and the management of public health emergencies and major events. So here we do actually monitor events, including for medicine shortages, including actually the shortage of immunoglobulins. But also these monitoring events actually includes, of course, medicines shortages, which might lead to a crisis situation. And these are, for example, or not for example, very specifically kind of public health emergencies or major events. So the regulation also sets and processes tools for shortages reporting and also the coordinated response of EU countries to shortages of critical medicines during a crisis situation, but also kind of in terms of preparedness. So one of the really fundamental structures here is the Medicine Shortages Steering Group, the MSSG. And for the medical devices, there's the MDSSG, so Medical Devices Shortages Steering Group. That is actually formalizes the formerly known EU Executive Steering Group on shortages caused by major event. steering group. And actually, this is a kind of an executive group which is supported by a working party. And in the next slide, actually, I will really go a little bit more into detail on this. But really here, the key benefit is that there's more coordination in preventing and mitigating medicines shortages in the EU. So this slide actually, and I will just spend a few minutes here, kind of is on the EU level coordination. So you have on the upper left side, actually, you have kind of the crisis and preparedness, actually, so public health emergencies and major events. And then on the right side, actually, there's the overview about, let's say, normal circumstances. So the EMA extended mandate is really focusing on the crisis and preparedness activities. And here it's actually, and as mentioned this before, there is the MSSG, which is the major executive steering group on shortages and safety of medicinal products. And it's an executive group which is then supported by, in the middle, kind of the medicine shortages SPOC, so single point of contact working party, which is really an operational group. So the operational group kind of provides support. It also drafts, for example, documents, and actually supports actually the executive group in their decision making processes. So just a few words actually on the executive group. So it provides an opinion on major events. It actually provides the list of critical medicines, and you might be aware actually that there have been 2 lists published during the last 2 years actually. So one of them was actually on COVID-19, and also it does monitor shortages, supply and demand, and actually during the public health emergency and the major events. And also it provides then, of course, recommendations to member states, to industry and other stakeholders, and also to the European Commission. So then, of course, on the right side, there is kind of in terms of normal circumstances, and I really would like to mention that the Medicine Shortages SPOC Working Party really bridges kind of these kind of crisis and preparedness activities, but also normal circumstances where actually kind of events that may lead actually to a major event or to a public health emergency are monitored. So there is also the EMA-HMA task force on availability of authorized medicine products, so the TFAAM, which is actually a policy group. And here it's really important to mention there no, let's say, product-specific aspects will be discussed. It's really kind of a supply and availability hub. It provides actually structural and strategic solutions, development of guidances and policies. And one of the achievements actually in the last year was to provide actually a definition of shortages and also provide guidance documents to marketing authorization holders for reporting shortages. And then actually I just want to mention that there is a close interaction, and this is something that's one of the key messages of my presentation today is actually, and that's also kicked off or has been mentioned this morning by Stefan van der Spiegel, there is a close kind of collaboration, and I think that's really a key kind of, so the coordination and also the cooperation between the different stakeholders, that's one of the key messages that I want to say, that I want to state today. So here actually I just want to mention our kind of close cooperation specifically with DG HERA and also with DG Santé. But also of course as the joint action on shortages is kind of course something I would like to mention here. So going actually then to the next slide. I'd like to give an overview about the breakout session of the EMA multi-stakeholder workshop on shortages. And my apologies, I forgot something, of course. So the MSSG, just for you in 30 seconds, kind of the executive group, the composition of this, because usually I have a slide actually that shows the composition. So how's the MSSG set up? And it's actually kind of representative of each member state are included in the group. There is actually members of the European Commission are represented, and also kind of members of the EMA are representative. There's close interactions actually with experts that can attend the meetings, and also observers from the agencies HCPWP, which is the Healthcare Professionals Working Party, and the PCWP, which is the Patient and Consumers Working Party, are attending these meetings. Just wanted to mention this, and then the working party, of course, it's the operational group. Also, members of the different member states are represented there. So, just coming back actually. So, in March we had an immunoglobulin breakout session. So, it was and that was part of a 2-day workshop actually on shortages that was organized. And actually, one of the actions that has been discussed, there was a breakout session from the immunoglobulins. And before I go to this, actually, I want to say actually a few initiatives actually for monitoring the supply and demand of the PDMPs that has been taken part actually at EMA level in the last years. So the first bullet point here is actually that there is regular updates provided to the SPOC working party, to the single point of contact working party during its monthly meetings. So we do have a standing agenda point actually on the discussion of immunoglobulins. And also shortages of the immunoglobulins have been discussed in the SPOC working party since 2019 and brought also to the attention to the higher executive group, which is the MSSG. So in the MSSG actually, so in the last year actually, the working party has also conducted a survey to really assess kind of the shortages within the European Union economic area, and I will come back to this actually in a few slides. So we do have, and now coming back actually to the communication aspects that were also mentioned this morning by Stefan van der Spiegel, we do have regular exchanges with the EC SOHO team, with EDQM, and also with ECDC as well through the blood cluster, which is actually then kind of exchange of information on the international level. And just to name here, so FDA and Health Canada. So also kind of in terms of surveys, so 2 surveys conducted in 2021 and 2022 have been conducted to map shortages and the availability issues of IVSC human normal immunoglobulins, and also to investigate root causes. And then also, of course, surveys on the impact of COVID-19 on PDMP supply have been conducted. So in the SPOC working party, actually, we do have drafting groups on specific topics. And one of these drafting groups is actually, or one of these working groups is actually dedicated to monitoring the supply, actually, or supply and availability of immunoglobulins. So the working party has been set up in February 2022, and a couple of countries, including Italy, including Belgium, Portugal, Spain, and Germany, are participating actually in the meetings of this working group. And also, of course, the European Commission and EMA, including also the Rheumatology Working Party, Scientific Secretariat, and the Chair are participating. So just kind of giving an overview about recent initiatives kind of that have been done within the SPOC Working Party, the MSSG, and also EMA. So the session on immunoglobulins, actually, it was a long session and it was an interesting session. And I know that some of the members in the room here or some of the participants have actually have been also in the discussion. So the objectives of the session on immunoglobulins were to inform of the regulatory landscapes and initiatives undertaken in the EU-EA, discuss actually the link between plasma supply and supply of immunoglobulins, and that's actually a very important action, kind of to really discuss and investigate these important link. And then also understand patients and healthcare professionals, industry's perspective on the availability and supply of immunoglobulins and also the plasma collection. And one of these aspects actually that have been really done, actually really facilitated in this interaction in this workshop was to facilitate and strengthen interactions between the involved stakeholders. So we really had kind of industry associations present, we had healthcare professionals, patients, organizations present, as well as, of course, members of the European Commission, of national competent authorities and EMA. So just a few words, and I would like to show a few data actually on a survey that we have conducted in 2022 to really understand actually the shortage situation of the marketed products in the EU-EA. So main objectives here is actually of the survey that has been conducted on the member state level, but also we have reached out to marketing authorization holders to receive an overview of the availability and also, of course, the shortage situation of the products in the individual countries. And to my knowledge, actually, a comprehensive survey in this kind of depth has not been taken so far. And actually, it was very important for us to really kind of understand the situation better. And I really have to say, actually, we only kind of scratched right now on the surface of the comprehensive data that we have received, and we are still kind of investigating, and will inform you further actually about further results of this, of course. So besides this, actually availability and shortages of the medicinal products, so the availability of stock level information, also about consumption, forecast demand data, that's something kind of we would like to investigate further. So, and just as I mentioned, actually, the information has been submitted by marketing authorization holders, by national competent authorities, and I would like to really say it's a close collaboration actually between the MAHs also and the SPOC Working Party immunoglobulin groups. So we would like to thank also the members and the participants actually of this very much actually for providing their data and the discussions. So 21 member states submitted the information, and currently data included from 19 member states are included. And just kind of mention again, so we are presenting right now preliminary results, and this graph actually gives you just an overview of products marketed in the UEA and the number of products actually affected by a market disruption in 2022. So this might be, for example, availability issues, this might be, for example, shortages issues. And when we just look at the graph, actually, we do have the 19 member states. The data have been received in September, October 2022. And actually here it's an overview about a stacked bar graph, actually about the number of marketed products per country and market disruption status in 2022. So what we can see is actually here that the colors, of course, distinguish the data. So the blue bar, actually, if you focus, for example, on the first one on the left side, so that's number A. So there is a country actually that has 19 products marketed. So that's not that's kind of not the authorization status; it's the marketing status, really. So and actually, 11 of these products actually market disruption has been kind of detected actually in 2022. So then actually there was also a couple of products that are actually where market disruption is anticipated. That's the green chart actually. And then actually the gray chart actually, the gray color shows actually the products that are not disrupted in 2022. So what we do see is actually when we look at the data that actually 4 of 19 countries were not affected by a market disruption in 2022. And then actually going a little bit further and aggregating the data, we have, and also that's again, of course, preliminary results. So this is an overview about the number of countries that were affected by a disruption of at least one product per year. So of all these authorized products, for example, of the 18 in the column for member state number A, actually, it only counts actually that one of these products has been in a shortage situation. And when we see now actually the number of shortages is really increasing. So we see in 2013, actually 111 up to 2016, and then there is an increase actually of the number of products that are in shortage in the member states. So this is kind of an overview about the preliminary results that we have received. So just going to give you a very short conclusion on these and actually ideas about what we are going to do further in this analysis. So the number of countries impacted by shortages of immunoglobulins is increasing. And only, as I mentioned before, actually on the previous slide, actually only 14 of 19 countries were not affected by a market disruption in 2022. Analysis of demand and supply data is ongoing. And very, very importantly, and that was also a feedback that I'm going to give you from the EMA workshop later, actually, the root causes and mitigation measures, that's an important aspect to really investigate. And we can do this actually on the data that we have received actually provides kind of this information. So that's also important actually for follow-up discussions with marketing authorization holders, but also with member states. So EMA continues to monitor shortages of immunoglobulins through the EU Single Point of Contact Working Party. And also we will continue to facilitate regular dialogue with MAHs to obtain a detailed overview of the availability and to discuss potential support measures to prevent or mitigate shortages in the EU EEA. So this is actually my last slide, and it's really kind of some of the actions that have been highlighted during the workshop, amongst many others, I have to say. So many kind of actions have been identified many actions have been identified, possible actions have been identified by the stakeholders participating. And three of them were actually are here in bullet points. So timely and accurate supply forecasting data from industry, but also from other stakeholders was highlighted as one of the key requirements for regulators to understand the supply situation and also plan measures to prevent or mitigate actual or potential shortages. There is a clear need actually for in-depth analysis of the root causes of the shortages and of the role actually that also pricing may play in the supply of PDMPs. And again, so closer collaboration between all stakeholders needs to be done actually to ensure, or needs to be done and further facilitated to ensure coordinated actions across the complex supply chain and improve the availability of immunoglobulins for EU citizens. So these are just a few of these actions, and as I stated, there was an intense discussion actually, many other actions, including need for harmonization actually in donor eligibility criteria, regulatory flexibilities have been discussed. But really I think one of these key aspects that we're going to pursue actually is the need and further collaboration actually between all involved stakeholders. With this, actually, I would like to end my presentation. I hope I could provide a short answer, actually, to the question that was asked. was
Did you say short?
I think I stayed in time. So
No, absolutely fine.
thank you so much.
Klaus, thank you so much for really the tour de force of everything that EMA has been doing, the mandate and what can we do. I think this is such a new piece of information, I think, for all of us. So maybe I can allow a couple of questions, or one question from the audience if there is one. I know we have limited time and we have a lot of ground to cover still, but I think one question is warranted. Is anyone interested in further deepening the knowledge on EMA mandate?
Actually, and elaborate actually on the medical devices mandate as well.
Not today, not today.
Just if somebody interested.
Right. Well, I can't see anyone asking questions, so we'll loop back to you, Klaus, towards the end of the session. I think we all be able to add to already a very rich presentation. But I think it's also a good practice as we starting with a lot of information, a lot of complexity, but then always asking the patient what it really means. So we've used the word shortages, we use the word, unmet medical need. So what really happens? We've been getting a lot of reports from patients across Europe, especially during COVID times, of what happens when the medication, the IVIGs, SIGs, so subcut versus IV, are unavailable or become unavailable. What is this negative impact? Because we spoke about the positive impact, right? You spoke about being cured, being managed, the disease being managed. But what happens when the shortage happens?
That's when we really see the snakes, because we fear what happens in our bodies. Because like I said previously, the medication, the treatment, gives us the energy, gives us the possibility to manage the disease and not fall back, and in my case, have a severe disability and go back into a wheelchair. That's something I fear and something that I would like not to face again in the future. So when I am told that there is a shortage and that there might not be a treatment, it actually is devastating, psychologically, emotionally, and physically. Sometimes it's hard to face it, but at times I understand also that the physicians don't have much of a choice, because it doesn't depend from their point of view or their will to give you the treatment. We went through this phase during COVID, of course, because there was a shortage. I live in Italy, and Italy does not produce enough plasma. So that is basically one of the problems. So if we don't have plasma, we don't have nothing to fractionate, and we don't have the immunoglobulin. I would like to take one moment out of this section just to say thank you to all of the donors. I was very moved and touched meeting with today's, I forget his name, Hilman, and there's another young lady in the audience that I met previously, and it is overwhelming for a patient to meet somebody who dedicates time and part of their life to donate plasma. That being said, I just want to say that it is difficult to face a rare condition, a disease that we do not know what will cause in the future, because someday it could happen that my body does not respond to immunoglobulins. So that's another phase. So I just would like to pressure and maybe talk to who is up there trying to manage this plasma collection to make sure that we try to face what is needed, and make sure that patients don't have to cry out for help, because it's very sad, and it's asking for charity, which is not charity, because it is a human and constitutional right to have your treatment.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much, Nancy. You've accentuated all the points, all the pain points that we are seeing. And Klaus, of course, you are doing the work to prevent, not just to mitigate the limited supply, but also to prevent that. So I think, with the collaboration that has been a common theme between the donors, the patients, as well as all the other bodies, as well as clinicians, is absolutely critical. With that in mind, I think I also wanted to, we'll come back to the plasma and donors. I think that will come as a good conclusion to this session. But maybe let's look back to the framework that is in the green paper, because one way of really optimizing the situation is looking really into the appropriate use. And you spoke, Richard, about the difference between need and demand. And I know you said it's very simple, but well, or at least it should be obvious. But I have recently collaborated with the South African blood and plasma donation centers, and they actually do equate need with demand, by which it means that the prescription pattern in the country is enough for them to estimate how much plasma is needed, which of course can be very inaccurate. So the need and demand, there is confusion, but there's also more confusion, because the limited accessibility, availability of plasma-derived medicinal products, immunoglobulins in particular, has many sources, many reasons, many causes. Some of it is regulatory, some of it is reimbursement-based, and again, another confusion that we are, at least I've been seeing a lot, is between the in-label, off-label, meaning the equation sign put between if something's in-label, it's appropriate use, if something's off-label, it's inappropriate use. It's a very simplistic way of looking at it. But I think, if you could comment on that confusion between in and off-label, and then what does the framework do, which we have already alluded to, so I think we're already aware of it, in order to resolve that conundrum of appropriate use.
Well, I think, as you say, it would be a very simplistic, facile way to equate these terms, because clearly labelling is a regulatory principle, and regulation may not take into account simply efficacy and toxicity, but may take into account all sorts of things like availability, financial structures, the infrastructure of the health service, the priorities in that country, awareness in that country, and so on. So there are all very many reasons why the two things are not equivalent. And indeed, something may be on label or in label, and yet have very little efficacy as well, and very little role to play in certain conditions. So the two terms are not at all synonymous. And I think that one illustration of this is that the labelling of a product for use can vary between countries, and between health systems, and between one part of a country and another. And clearly the science doesn't. So it suggests there are other factors involved rather than the scientific thing. I think what we need to go back to do is to try to be as clear as possible about the medical basis, the evidence basis for efficacy, its safety, and the disease burden, how the magnitude of that benefit, and the practicality of it, and the availability, the possibility of other treatments, and the availability and practicality of those alternative treatments. And I think we have to go back to those principles as the guiding thing. I don't know what else I can say about it, really, but the outline in the paper is a kind of methodology for trying to be logical and rational and equitable and consistent about these things.
And I think that's the key point, the transparency, the consistency, the equity of it, which hasn't been applied. As you say, the differences, not just between the countries and systems, even within countries and systems, are such that they are not justified, that there is no good rational reasons for them to occur. Well, you've made a great point about the, well, we both did, about the non-equation sign between off and in label. And I know I've promised you always to hear the patient voice. And I know, Nancy, you have told me you've had your own share of experiences with the off-label procedures. And I think, again, if you could shed the light, because it's not just a concept, it's not just a regulatory concept, it has a real impact on a patient's life.
It does, because it happened a couple of years ago, because today immunoglobulin is indicated for CIDP, but around 10 years ago, I believe, I was actually going around hospitals demanding for my infusion, because some hospital managements could not prescribe the immunoglobulin because it was an off-label prescription, and being an off-label, they had to prescribe it through a certain law in Italy, and that meant that the hospital would have to copay on it, and it was a very large amount of money, because we know that it costs, it is very expensive as a treatment. And it was, as I said before, it was very embarrassing. It was not at all enlightening, and you just feared that you could not get your treatment and then go back to prednisone, maybe corticosteroids, which had another impact on my condition because it would cause other conditions as osteoporosis and vision quality and all that stuff. So, and we did have a few meetings in Italy with a couple of regional institutions because I live in Sicily, so I had the opportunity to speak to the Health Commission to make sure that they could reach an agreement with the pharmaceutical companies and the National Institute. Now, as I said, that is not a problem for my condition, but it still is a problem for a lot of other PIDs or other immunodeficiency conditions. And it is, it's not promising for a patient because, like I said, the only thing we demand is a treatment, a fair treatment, and that we are recognized as people that need to be treated equally and just obtain some reassurance for their health condition. I think it's very simple. It's just a matter of wanting it, that we all want the same thing.
Absolutely. So that's where the equity comes in, right?
Yes.
And I think you've accentuated extremely well the burdens, right? There's of course the clinical burden or the therapeutic burden. Not being treated means having a relapse, having a physical disability, or even death in some cases.
Yes.
When you have an extreme immune deficiency. Then there is of course the psychological one, the fear of not having something available.
And a social and economic one, because then because you cannot integrate with the society, you cannot work because then you're on a sick leave. So it just collapses. Your world just doesn't have a future.
Yeah. Well, and for the patient, of course, the one that we never think of is this administrative and financial burden. As you say, when you have to go through the off-label procedure, not only is it demeaning because you seem to be begging for something,
yes,
but also it's a great burden. So the word burden becomes sort of a daily reality on all type of dimensions.
So true, so true.
Thank you, Nancy, for that. I think it really puts... Sorry, Richard.
No, I think it's also worth mentioning that, of course, whether you're using something in-label or off-label has different implications in different health systems, different financial implications in different health systems.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Absolutely.
True. Yes.
Thank you for that. Well, we're going to change the pace a little bit. And again, the word burden becomes a very important one here because we know, and I know Jaap and Martin will speak about it more explicitly, that the growing burden of side effects of modern treatments causing secondary immune deficiencies, B-cell depletion. So I know, Jaap, you have a couple of slides explaining this phenomenon that is not only growing, but potentially is going to be a huge burden for the healthcare systems in the future, and what happens when the B-cell depletion occurs, what does it cause, and why immunoglobulins are, well, essentially the only effective treatment. If we can pull up the Jaap slides, that would be great.
Yep. Yeah, I just have a few slides, and I would like to start with a quote from Einstein. If you can't explain complex substance in a simple way, then you probably haven't understood it yourself. So if you don't understand what I say, it's not your fault, it's probably mine. Okay, well, this first slide is an easy one. So these are all slides, all diseases from different disease areas that are associated with secondary hypogammaglobulinemia. And this is in part due to the underlying disease and in part due to the treatment that's given. Okay, so what are the predictors of hypogammaglobulinemia and serious infections? This is from a research study in 184 patients who received Richard, I hope you don't mind me presenting this, ocrelizumab or rituximab, because I know you are in horror about this, for treatment of MS or other neurological diseases. Well, 12% of patients receiving B-cell therapy developed hypogammaglobulinemia, and 11% developed serious infections. And other risk factors in this study were elderly age and white race. So you can essentially identify risk patients on the basis of these features. Lymphopenia was also an associated risk factor for serious infection. So what is rituximab? For those of you who are not familiar with this, rituximab is a biotech-engineered antibody which recognizes a particular molecule which is present on the surface of a particular subset of immune cells, B cells. B cells are critical in production of immunoglobulins. So normally our B cell system makes sure that we have sufficient number of immunoglobulins. And these immunoglobulins are produced by the fully maturated subset of B cell lineage cells, the plasma cells on the top right. So as you can see, the cells have a change of appearance, and they are mass producers of antibodies. Rituximab depletes precursors of plasma cells. So by depleting precursors of plasma cells, you will end up with fewer plasma cells producing antibodies, including the good ones, right? So although the primary purpose may be to deplete autoreactive B cells that produce autoantibodies, it cannot distinguish between the good B cells and the bad B cells. So all the B cells will be depleted irrespective of whether they produce autoantibodies or protective antibodies. Now, rituximab also has other effects on the immune system, which are less well appreciated, I think. One is late onset neutropenia. Neutropenia refers to another type of immune cell, the granulocytes, which are also necessary for the immediate protection against infections. So if you don't have neutrophils or granulocytes, you'll have a double problem. It's like a double whammy being imposed on the immune system. So you have hypogammaglobulinemia, referred to as a low state of immunoglobulins in blood, and you may have a late-stage neutropenia, which, by the way, is not occurring in all patients. So in all patients, you will have low Ig levels because of repeated doses of rituximab, but late-onset neutropenia is rarer. Now, rituximab needs to be given in multiple, not in escalating, but at repeated intervals. So it's not a curative treatment for autoimmune disease, and that's where the problem is. If you could cure autoimmune disease with a single infusion of rituximab, we would all be very happy. Even doctors would be happy. The problem is because you need to give repeat doses of rituximab, let's say every 6 months or every 12 months, the immune system gets hit every time with rituximab. And this factor is the key determinant in introducing low IgG levels in patients. And this predisposes them to infections. Now, that rituximab is a critical drug was proven in the COVID pandemic. So many studies, both in rheumatology and in neurology and in other specialty fields, have now clearly demonstrated that if patients with autoimmune diseases were treated with rituximab, they had a higher risk of severe COVID infection. So of all the drugs that we prescribe in rheumatology, and there are many these days, rituximab stood out in on all these studies. And that's a problem because rituximab is a very nice, effective drug. It affects the autoimmune disease and patients are happy with it. But to run a risk of death or ICU admission because of your rituximab use is not a good idea. And there were no associations between other biological drugs and IL-6 neutralizing drug and COVID-19 infection. So rituximab is unique in this respect. And these are the outcomes in patients with inflammatory rheumatic and musculoskeletal diseases who were treated with rituximab, a study published 2 years ago. And what you can see is the p-value. The lower the p-value, the higher the significance. So a p-value of 0.04 and 0.0046 means that there is a statistical significant difference between patients who were treated with rituximab or were not treated with rituximab. So again, rituximab treatment predisposed to severe COVID infection. And although the death rate was not different, but that's because of the low numbers. And that's what I had to tell in 5 minutes. I hope you understood the gist of my talk. If not, I'm happy to answer your questions after the talk.
Thank you so much, Jaap. And I've seen lots of nodding, so I think you've been understood. I think it's been incredibly interesting because here we have really hard rituximab data, a single medication data that is very convincing, very overwhelming. But of course, there are many more B-cell depleting therapies out there that maybe the correlation is not yet known. And I know there has been growing body of evidence, and I would love Martin to comment on it, that we have such a high hope for CAR T cells. That seems such a breakthrough therapy. Like rituximab was about 10 years ago when it came onto market, that was a breakthrough. Now CAR T cells are breakthrough, but I think we talked about this, and there is a growing body of evidence that CAR T cells cause a very similar phenomenon. Could you maybe bring it closer to our attention?
Yes, it's a very exciting development. But before that, I see in that an intercellular matrix, and maybe that's a group's deformation, professional deformation, psychologically. But about CAR T cells, we heard from Jaap, it's about B cells. B cells differentiate into plasma cells and they produce your immunoglobulins. It can also go in the wrong direction, and B cells can turn into a malignancy, and that's called a non-Hodgkin lymphoma, B cell non-Hodgkin lymphoma. That's treated by the hematologist with chemotherapy and rituximab. And it's quite effective. It's raising the survival. It's very good. The last, let's say, 8 years, about, a new therapy has been developed, and that's called CAR T cells. It's your own lymphocytes are taken out of your blood, and they are changed, and we bring in a receptor. And we bring in a receptor in your T cells because they are extremely good in killing cells, like cancer cells or viral infected cells. So they can attack your tumor. So your own blood is taken out, changed, and injected back. And that has a quite very high rate in refractory malignant lymphomas, depending on the type, about 70%, and even in B-cell leukemia, even to 90%. That is quite common in children, this disease. So this is used now, and they are improving the CAR T cells. We are not there, but it's very promising. And there was a paper at the end of 2022. I think the most exciting paper of the last few years. The group of George Schett from Nuremberg published that he have treated an autoimmune disease related to B cells called systemic lupus erythematosus. This is a very severe rheumatic disease, especially in females. It's about 10 to 1. With CAR T cells to get rid of your B cells. And he has treated 5 severe young, 4 women, 1 man, very young, with this CAR T cell therapy, and they recovered after all the former treatments, and this is amazing. They lost the autoantibodies, and he has treated now some more patients, and we are like to do that as well. We are setting up this therapy in my clinic. A side effect of that, when you get rid of your B cells, you will lose also your antibody production. And when this therapy is successful, as it looks like now, I don't know what we will face, but now, then probably we need more immunoglobulins to treat these patients with immunoglobulins as well, as a side effect, a secondary immunodeficiency, a side effect of this therapy. But it looks very promising.
Thank you so much. as you say, I don't want to depress anyone here because we are speaking of extremely breakthrough and promising therapies with which we have so much hope for, and yet they do have that very, very high burden negative effect or side effect. And of course, the only efficacious treatment that we know of for those is immunoglobulins. And that yet again proves how much of a growth in medical need we are seeing for these therapies. And I think that, of course, impacts the main topic, the perennial issue or the prerequisite that we need to solve, which is the plasma donation, the plasma collection, the plasma volumes that we have, not just in Europe, but worldwide. And before we move to the plasma collection itself, which is one of the big recommendations of the green paper itself, I'm very painfully aware we have little time. So I think now's really the time to give each one of our panelists, an opportunity to reconclude, to really say what is truly important from this panel, from the green paper itself, what you would like to accentuate to our lovely audience. And I'll try to, at the end, speak a little bit about a few recommendations together with Richard from the green paper, because they are quite orderly. Hopefully we'll bring the discussion back to focus. So Klaus, maybe starting with you. You have spoken about EMA mandate. You have spoken about what is already being done, but what all of us can do. You spoke about collaboration, multi-stakeholder collaboration. So clearly that collaboration needs to have an impact. What can we do? Or whatever other conclusion you wish to draw from today's panel. I don't mean to insinuate that this is the conclusion. No,
absolutely. No, thank you so much. I really like the association with the intracellular network, but also I see extracellular matrix here. So that's another component.
I think we're all deformed mentally when you see those things.
So I really want to stress, there are so many aspects, and I think shortages related to immunoglobulins, it is really important to understand supply, demand, actually, what are the indications actually, or what are the contribution of new indications actually in the increasing demand actually on immunoglobulins in the, let's say, upcoming years. It also kind of tells us how important it is actually the demand forecast, so an accurate kind of demand forecast and developing models for this. So actually one of my and I would like to re-emphasize this, so one of my key messages is really kind of facilitation, the contact between all stakeholders, the interaction, but also kind of facilitating data collection. So that's kind of a really key component. And kind of there will be many kind of new systems kind of being potentially available kind of to collect data, but also to analyze data. And that's so kind of, I think, really emphasis on the interaction between all stakeholders.
Thank you so much, Klaus. Very, very succinct and extremely powerful recommendation. And I think that also leads me to, we're talking about collaboration, and part of collaboration is sometimes misunderstood. We think, stakeholders in the healthcare system are payers, policymakers, regulators, clinicians, but the patient seems to be the end recipient rather than stakeholder. It's still a lot of confusion there. So I think I would love Nancy maybe to comment on this a little bit. One of the recommendations of the Green Paper itself speaks of the inclusions of patients in those collaborations, in listening to the patients, in having the patient voice represented. How can we best do it? How would you like to see it done, that collaboration with the patients as a stakeholder and not the end recipient only?
Well, this is evidence right now, because you invited me here to speak. You invited a donor, and it's a nice collaboration. It's a synergy. I think that's the chain. The chain has to be from the industries, the patients, the donors. We need to collaborate all together and to find a common ground. The common ground is to find more plasma and to make sure to raise awareness. My promise, from my point of view as a patient advocate and as a patient, which I always represent myself as basically, is to go out and tell my story and make people aware of our difficulties, all patients' difficulties. In this condition, in this situation, I can only tell my story, and that's the only game that I can play. So I hope that is helpful enough. And from PPTA, which I want to thank for always including the patient in the context of this, of these meetings, that is very important to us.
I agree. I think in this room we have gotten used to having patients always in, but that's not a common practice elsewhere in the medical world or in the healthcare ecosystem.
True. So we must.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for this. And maybe starting with Martin or with Jaap, you've been put on the spot to explain the most difficult concept so far. So maybe now, beyond those difficult concepts, what are your key recommendations, key conclusions? How can we counteract the limitations, but also how can we cater for that growing medical need?
I think we need, for the rare immunological diseases, good registries to measure the outcome of immunoglobulin therapies. That's very important. We need maybe faster, or everybody works on, I know that in the industry, in the EMA as well, to have reconvalescent sera to prevent patients with immune deficiencies for a virus. And one thing that we have to realize, because of your presentation, we talked about corona. Corona had a very, very severe comorbidity. That's cardiac disease. People are dying from that. And it was very rare, very, very rare, luckily. And the therapy with some steroids and immunoglobulin therapy is very successful in these patients. So it can be, I hope not, with the pandemic, we have to realize that we maybe use immunoglobulins to fight the comorbidities of a pandemic. It was not so severe in corona, that part, talking about the heart, but we have to realize that for, I hope not, but for a next pandemic.
Thank you so much. Well, not a very cheerful conclusion. No, but I think you are right, because we are discovering continuously the normal prevalence indications in diseases where IgGs are extremely efficacious. We are discovering them, but they are, they have had stable prevalence. Yeah. But what you are accentuating is, we are coming face to face with pandemics that cause extreme increase in medical need for treatment. And again, immunoglobulins happen to be the only effective treatment. Yeah. Yep. Let's hear from you as well, please.
Yes, I had a dream. and I think the dream is what Martin and Klaus already echoed, is that, when 20 years ago, when biological DMARDs, immunosuppressants, were introduced in rheumatology practice, payers didn't want to pay unless the rheumatologist kept a registry to document the efficacy and safety of these biologicals. And that worked very well. It was a catalyst of change, and we have learned a lot from these registry studies. And we are now, I think, much better in selecting right patients. And to me, it's always surprising how the IVIG field is so fragmented, and that apparently there's no incentive for payers to force clinicians to document data on efficacy and safety, and to force clinicians to collaborate nationally or internationally. And I think the reason is because we deal with very rare diseases, so it's not, it doesn't reach the conscience of the payers. So what may happen is that if more and more rare diseases are being treated with IVIG, someone wakes up and in the insurer party and says, what's going on here? We missed something. And so the dream is that, people will come together, and it doesn't cost a lot of money or effort, in my humble opinion, because we're dealing with very expensive drugs. And so it shouldn't be that difficult to set up this type of collaboration. So I hope it doesn't stay a dream.
It is a dream. But I think you've said something very significant. Why do payers not force the clinicians to think in a more collaborative manner? But there's also the reverse psychology with the payers themselves. So they think in terms of medication. But the way clinicians typically collaborate is around disease states or indications. Maybe we should have a much broader collaboration, cross-indication, cross-specialty, focused on IVIGs. We know of some initiatives. Professor Alexander Enck, who was involved in our advisory group, is actually involved in setting up a global registry for rare dermatological diseases that are treatable with IgGs. But maybe the way forward, I'm now hypothesizing, is to have a registry for all diseases that we know of that are treatable by IVIGs, to really go back to the payer or policymaker and say, look, you think product, you don't think disease. Now we have brought you very complex data on the product level across the disease state. Well, maybe that's my dream. And again, last but not least, Richard, I know it's sort of difficult to follow with everything that has been said already and what you've already said, but what is your final couple of words? If we have a couple of minutes, maybe we can allow some questions from the audience, but first, over to you.
Firstly, I'm sorry about the colourful use of the word horror. It quickly turned to envy when we saw what happened with rheumatoid arthritis. So, I suppose I'd make two comments, really, one as a neurologist and one as a person. As a neurologist, I think that what we have failed to do in neurology is to enter people into studies and trials like oncologists and hematologists have done. And I think we really need to do that. And alongside that, we do need to have disease registries. And I think because these are rare diseases, and I've dealt with the rare disease, CJD, you need international collaboration. It has to be global. And along the line with that, I think we do need proper endpoints that have clinical meaning in the quality of life for patients. There are too many neurology studies on immunoglobulins which measure a particular figure of something which is meaningless in the patient's life. So that's my first thing, is basically get better information, international collaboration, national registries. And then as a person, and this is probably embarrassing to admit in this audience here, but I was unaware as a member of the population of the importance of plasma and how much it was used. I came into this through CJD, and even as a neurologist, I wasn't particularly aware of it till we started using immunoglobulin, and then people said, the supply's running out, and I thought, well, why? Where does it come from? And I'd heard about being a blood donor, but I'd never heard about donating plasma. So I think that clearly in the general population, we do have a big exercise to educate and increase awareness of these things. That's the only way we're going to at least start to get better supply, although that has to be followed on with the proper infrastructure for doing it.
Fantastic. And thank you for bringing it back home to the patient as well by saying, you know, we often quote this well-known equation, what is value? We talk about IgGs being extremely valuable for the societies, for the medical system, for the patients, but value is often defined as outcomes that matter to patients divided by net costs. And again, net costs, not the gross cost, because the amount of hospitalizations that IgGs prevent, or PDMPs in general, is quite extraordinary. So the net cost actually remains quite low, even though the treatment or unit cost may be quite high. Well, anyway, I don't want to finish by talking about value-based healthcare. So I would like to thank you all for incredible contribution, a really, really vibrant discussion on all angles. And before we break up and I invite Martin, I know we have overrun. I'm known to overrun with discussions, so I'm no longer even apologizing for it. I thought, you know, if you know that I'm going to run the session, you know it's going to overrun. But with that in mind, maybe there is a pressing, really important question from someone. It's actually quite difficult to see against the light, so I'm not sure if someone's raising their hand. So please stand up and speak if you do have a question. Okay. I think it's been a long 2 days, so I think everyone's quite keen to finalize the IPPC. So again, thank you very much to all of you, and I've enjoyed it immensely, and I think we've made quite a few good points. If only we can implement a few of those recommendations, I think we'll go a very long way to resolving some of the perennial issues surrounding the IVIGs. With the recognition of value, with the recognition of what the solutions might be, this hopefully is a perfect conclusion to the IPPC in general, not just to this panel. And I would like to invite Martin to come on stage and say a few closing words.
A few closing words and a few promises. So I have an Apple Watch with me here. It was part of the Passport program. So if you have completed the Passport program, you were able to win the Apple Watch. So I will pick in innocent hands to draw a number. So maybe Klaus.
Okay, I draw, but I
pass it over. Like that.
913, 913.
Congratulations. That leads me to thank everybody again. Thank all of the speakers for bringing a very interesting discussion and debate. To thank all of the sponsors for supporting us to make this conference possible. Also to thank all of the participants to create a great atmosphere and to participate to the debate. Also a big thank you to the technical team for all the AV, for the photographs, for the video recordings. But can I also ask for a special applause for the team who made all of this happen? So, we didn't want to make all of this conference about the SOHO debate, but it is an important topic that is ongoing at the moment. It could lead us into another new era. And I think that everything we spoke about during this conference is also a little bit linked to the SOHO debate. So what is really in the core of this SOHO debate? So first, let's start with donor health and donor safety. It's a topic we touched upon yesterday. It's also very important for us as an industry because we rely on healthy and frequent donors to donate their plasma. We also looked at the evidence of donor health and donor safety. For example, we looked at a study was shown where we followed 12 million donations of about 1 million donors. And we saw that only in 99.84% there were no donor adverse events. And if there were donor adverse events, they were very mild and everything was comparable to a blood donation. So actually we can conclude that plasma donation does not imply a significant risk. We talked about the growing clinical needs a few times already today. Patient access to medicines is also in the core of what we do. It's also in the core of what the European institutions do. The EU has a strategy, a pharma strategy in place to grow open strategic autonomy for critical medicines. They want to do that by decreasing the dependency of starting materials from third countries, so also very much linked to the plasma debate, to decrease the dependency on plasma coming from the United States. Thomas provided great words that, however, it's not only about plasma, it's also about availability, accessibility, and sustainability in terms of access to medicines. Going back to the debate on SOHO, a lot of discussion is about the ethical dimensions about SOHO, and European policymakers may even dilute, because of that, the entire debate of what it is about. So if we would set rules for that debate, maybe the first rule of compensation should be not to talk about compensation. Because what is in the core of the debate, actually what we need, and was concluded here as well, the EU needs more plasma. And public and private sector can work together to achieve that. We've looked earlier today at different models on how to collect plasma, and none of them is perfect, but there is still a lot of potential. But what do we know? What do we know? I think Matthew presented it, or he has it in his report. There is an annual growth of about 7% of IG use. Maybe there will be even more because of the new indications. We know that for the public sector, they have a big ambition to increase public plasma collection. I think one of the countries has its biggest ambition is to grow 5%. I think Johan said it before, it's not only about ethics, it's also about mathematics. So if there's 7% growth in IG need, clinical need, medical need, and there's a 5% growth in plasma collection, it means that we need to work together. We've seen that our industry has a history in plasma collection and plasma fractionation, but we also have a future ahead of us in which we need to work with all stakeholders. So let's be grateful for donors, dedicated to patients, caring for all, and this is what we are. This is PPTA. Thank you.